Hi, my name's Paul Grogan. Welcome to episode 67 of the Gaming Rules podcast. In this episode, I'm going to be talking to Frank West, designer of City of Kings and Vidorian Gardens, and also the organiser of the City of Games, which is a board game convention in Bristol in the UK, which actually I was at a couple of weekends ago. As always, thank you very much to all of my Patreon supporters. Without your support, this podcast wouldn't be possible. And if you enjoy my content, either this podcast or any of the other content that I create, then please consider supporting me over at patreon.com/gaming rules. And now, let's get on with the show. So welcome to the show, Frank.
Cool, thank you for having me, Paul.
No, thanks for coming on the show. So how is it in sunny Bristol today?
Not too sunny. There was a little bit of frost on the floor this morning. But for those who don't know me, I always wear shorts and a t-shirt. So it was one of those mornings where everyone was judging me as I walked down the street, skipping along.
That's one thing that Vicky does. Every time we're out and it's cold, she goes, "Have you seen him there? He's wearing shorts." But yeah, I've got a friend of mine, Mark, who always wears shorts as well. So
I can't remember the last time I wore trousers. It was a good few years ago, to say the least. I don't own any now. I mean, literally, I don't have a single pair of them. So
right. So for those people who are just sort of tuning into this topic, the topic of discussion today is trousers.
Yep, exactly. Or shorts, as it were.
Or shorts, yeah. We're not going to be talking about games at all. No. I'm really nice about the weather, because I'm down in Clumpton. I'm about an hour, as the crow flies from you, probably an hour and a half drive.
Yeah, it's not too far.
Clear blue skies, sunshine today. I might go out and do a bit of sunbathing later on.
I'm jealous. I'll come down there with my shorts. It'll be fine.
Pop down. Yeah, shorts will be... they'll look the part here today. So, anyway, right. Before we get on to talking about the games, just give people a little bit of a short introduction about you.
Okay, cool. So I'm Frank West, and apparently I'm obsessed with shorts. I didn't realise that until now. But I'm 32 years old, and I live in Bristol in England. I have been a video gamer for my entire life, and in the last 5 to 10 years, that slowly transitioned over to playing board games. I've spent most of my life being a programmer and being an interface designer, and I really just enjoy logical problem solving and creating things that look pretty. And I spend a lot of my time with that, and with my girlfriend Sarah, who also works on many projects with me, and are recently acquired. Acquired is totally the wrong word, isn't it?
I use acquired at all.
Recently, our new cats. There we go. I'll go with the new cats, turned up. I don't think we acquired the cats. They just arrived into our lives one day.
Yeah, knocked on the door.
Exactly. Meowing a little bit for some food, and there they are.
Yeah. So, for those people who don't know, Frank is the designer of City of Kings, Vidorian Gardens, and the organiser of City of Games, which is a UK board game convention in Bristol that's just had its second one.
Yep, which is amazing, really. It's one of those things where for many years in my previous life, when I was in the programming world, I used to go and do a lot of talks at events and conventions and shows. And I always liked the idea of running my own. But the idea of running something like that and getting talkers and speakers and they're very big, expensive events, where people are paying hundreds and hundreds of pounds to go. And it just didn't feel like the kind of thing I wanted to get into. But having been getting so heavy into the board game industry, it was an opportunity to explore that part of my life as well.
Yeah, and it's been successful.
Yeah, for sure. I've been more than happy with how it's gone, and this year I believe went better than last year, and hopefully we can continue to improve and grow the show.
Yeah. So this is, is it a fixed weekend that it happens? Is it like the second weekend in...
Yeah, so the first year it was the second. This year it was the third weekend, I believe, or it was the weekend later. But it's we were looking around to see if we could find other venues. So originally the goal was to keep it on that same weekend, but we spent a lot of time this last year looking to see if we could find a different place, which meant that we left it a bit later to book, and therefore we did have to move it a weekend later. And now we're trying to work out whether we preferred the weekend before or after Valentine's Day, because that's actually quite important for a lot of people, it seems.
It is, yeah, apparently so. So, basically, sometime around the middle of February is when it is in Bristol. And it sold out within...
Yeah, it was 23 hours this year.
Yeah, I was going to say, within a day.
Crazy.
So it is one that you can't really turn up to because it's limited spaces, and you've just got to be, keeping an eye on the Facebook page, do you have a mailing list or something?
Yeah, so on the cityofgames.com, we have a mailing list at the bottom, and what we do each year is that we send out an update several months before the tickets are going live and kind of say, this is the time, on this day, they will be available. And then, unfortunately, at the moment, it's a first come, first serve. Obviously,
Yes.
we're trying to increase the space each year, but we can't keep up with that demand just yet.
No. So that's City of Games. Now, a quick summary of City of Kings.
Oh my goodness, that's always the hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, how do you summarise something? I mean, it's huge.
It is. It's pretty big, and it keeps getting bigger with the expansions, the new content. But for me, I always kind of refine it down to the City of Kings is a 1 to 4 player kind of fantasy cooperative adventure puzzle game. So it's this game where you're going to be exploring across these map tiles, and by that you're going to be turning them over and encountering different things. You might find a shop where you can trade for items. You might find a resource location where you can gather resources to trade for those items. You might find people that need help with various tasks, or you're going to find creatures. And as you progress through the game, everything's just going to get harder and harder. The creatures, each one will be stronger than the last, but they're all generated in such a way that they kind of give you these different puzzles that you need to kind of overcome through this kind of deterministic combat system.
And that was on Kickstarter, when was it? A couple of years ago now?
It was. So the first Kickstarter was a couple of years ago, because it delivered in early 2018, and then the reprint was on in 2018 that delivered at the start of 2019. So it's been a good couple of years of Kickstarters and kind of like reprinting the game, which is, always a great thing.
And it's now available at retail as well, is that right?
It is, yeah. We are now available in 17 countries as of the 21st of February, I believe, was the kind of official release date. And, that's super exciting. The first print run sold out within kind of 2 days, and the second print run has been just that much bigger and that much more. And I'm just really excited to kind of see how it kind of goes into all of these different regions.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the market is there for fantasy cooperative 1 to 4 player games.
Yeah, and we definitely have a kind of, our game is very different to a lot of the games that are out there. And I think that's kind of one of the things that's really interesting about the City of Kings. And one of the biggest challenges I faced with it was I designed a game that I kind of wanted to design. And that's not to say we didn't obviously do lots of playtesting, have lots of feedback and iterate it. But it was trying to be something different to your kind of standard dungeon crawl game or something along those lines. And that means that I always say to people that I highly recommend you kind of watch a video on how the game plays, or kind of, go to Board Game Geek and kind of read through some of the reviews and stuff, just to kind of get a real understanding of the kind of unique factors of the game before you buy it.
Because, as you say, it is different.
Exactly.
Now, moving on to your next game, which is
Gardens.
Just released.
Yes.
Now, this is sufficiently different from City of Kings, I think it's fair to say.
Somewhat, yes.
A tiny box.
Yep.
I mean, not minute, but, much smaller than City of Kings, and a very different game.
Yeah, and it's funny because obviously when I get games kind of manufacturers, they come to us on pallets. And this year, the City of Kings, we could fit 36 games on a pallet, and Vodoran Gardens, we could fit 900. So it was quite different, to say the least.
Yeah. But that's been going down quite well. I mean, I've not had a chance to play it myself, but I've spoken to a few people that have. And it's interesting because obviously I do a lot of work with CGE.
Yeah.
And I remember the year that I was at Essen and I was demoing Through the Ages, like non-stop for 4 days at a table at the front. And behind me, there were 30 tables demoing Codenames.
Yes.
And I'm like, same designer. And they were like, nah, I don't believe that. And it's interesting how a lot of people, for example, Vital Lacerda, who I do a lot of work with, if you buy a Vital Lacerda game, you know what you're going to get.
Yeah.
Right, it's going to be heavy, and it's going to be 4 or 5 hours on your first play, and it's going to take you 3 games before you get used to it. And he's great at doing that, and that's what he does. But having the versatility to design something like City of Kings and then Vodoran Gardens, versatility is the key phrase there. I mean, did you deliberately say, right, I've done City of Kings, I'm now going to do something completely different?
Yes and no. I mean, I didn't sit out and say I'm going to do a tiny box game, but I very much sat there and said, I don't want to become known as the guy that does cooperative adventure games.
Right.
I want to be known as someone who kind of produces games along a similar line, but mechanically are different. So Vidorian Gardens to City of Kings, I would say they're both very puzzly, very thinky kind of games. And Vidorian Gardens, whilst it's very small, is still the kind of game where it's going to give you a lot of kind of decisions and a lot of planning. And to a point where the cards in play kind of allow you to plan your current turn, your next turn, and some of the turn after that as you go through. So it's really about knowing what's there. And for me personally, I enjoy games which are thinky and heavy. I play lots of different games, but I want to create a range of games which are thinky and heavy, but equally appeal to different people. So Vidorian Gardens is often kind of said as a more complex version of King Domino, and a game that, if you've played King Domino lots and you want something that's harder, but, just as simple to learn, but harder to do well, then it's kind of a good step up game for that. And I think for me, that's kind of what we're aiming for with it.
Right. And what are you working on at the moment then?
So at the moment, there's 2 games I'm working on. One of them is simply referred to as Project Ella, and we've put no details out there about that game at all. So I'm not going to really say much, but it's a game which is another white box game. So by that I mean it's the smaller Vidorian Gardens kind of smaller piece of smaller box, is the word I'm looking for. And again, it's not going to be hundreds of thousands of pieces, but a nice puzzly kind of game. Okay. And then the other game is Rising Blades. Rising Blades is our next kind of black box game, as I refer to it, which is a bigger kind of heavier game. Now, Rising Blades is very different to the City of Kings in the fact that it's a competitive game, and it's a bit more of a hybrid between worker placement and adventure. It's one of the challenges that we have of it, and the biggest challenge I have at the moment is, again, similar to the City of Kings, is making sure we can work out how to describe the game to people properly, because effectively it's a game where you're going to be adventuring across a board, and you're going to be placing tiles. So similar to kind of Carcassonne or something like that, you'll have map tiles and you'll be able to place them down to kind of form pathways, but on top of that you'll have your character who you'll be leveling up, you'll be specializing into different things, but then as the board is made, there'll be different locations where you as an individual can do different actions, and it'll be working in the kind of the efficiencies of what paths to take, where you want map tiles, where you want to go, how you want to level up, and kind of how you can combine that with the limited actions you have to kind of achieve the best result.
Okay, now you've been working on Rising Blades for a while, haven't you?
Yeah, it's been about 2 years now, so it's another kind of big project.
And the plan for that is to go on to Kickstarter?
In 2019, we haven't kind of set a specific date because I firmly believe that I'm lucky to be in a position that I don't have to release a game at any point. I don't have hundreds of staff. I'm not in a financial situation where I can't pay people's bills if I don't release it. So for me, a game is ready when I believe it's ready, and when the feedback from playtesting and blind playtesting is sufficient that I'm confident the game is in a good place.
Yeah, because both of us have probably seen games that have been released and you play it and you think, yeah, they rushed this one out.
Exactly.
And you think, and the game suffers because of that. So before we go on to the questions from the people, there's something that you mentioned that I just wanted to touch on. You say you come from a video gaming background.
Yes.
And then about 5 or so years ago, you've got more into the board gaming side of things because you like this working out puzzles and things like that. Do the thought processes and the decision processes that you go through when you're playing a board game give you scratch that itch a lot more than it did in the computer game?
I think it's interesting. So, and a lot of this is kind of, it comes down to the person and what they're looking for. But one of the things I found with video games is the transition of video games from when I was a young child to kind of recent years has been that you've moved away from sitting with a group of people to sitting on your own and talking kind of over headsets. Yeah. And the games themselves have become simplified in many ways. Yeah. And that's not to say when you're playing multiplayer, because you're playing against other humans, they potentially are harder But when you're playing against kind of AIs and kind of just through the levels of a game, they feel like they're becoming easier because people are more rewarded by simple kind of tasks that they feel like they've kind of done well in, as opposed to sitting there for hundreds of hours trying to solve a single little thing.
Yeah.
And I think for me that board games, in some ways, have kind of been the counter to that, where, you know, board games are more and more now about sitting at tables with groups of people, and the more heavier, complex board games are really about you've got a single like problem to solve, and you've got, you know, 4 or 5 hours to work out the best way to do that.
Yeah.
So I feel like for me, board games are replacing what kind of started to disappear in that video game side of things.
Right. Okay, cool. Right, so some questions. One of the things that I came up with, and this was, I think, the original topic of the conversation, and when it came up, is people wanted to know a little bit more about the ins and outs of the industry side of things. And for those people who are listening, Frank isn't just the designer of City of Kings. You pretty much run this project. I mean, Sarah's helped you out a lot with a number of things, but everything else has been you. You ran the Kickstarter, you handled production, you handled all of the logistics.
Yep.
I believe you actually went to China yourself and you know, sailed the boat that brought... Is that not true?
No, not quite, but it's certainly... in all seriousness, I did actually look into going to China, but I couldn't get my visa in time, so it was close.
Right. So some of the things that can go wrong with the production and shipping side of things, and how you overcome that. And the reason I've come up with this question is because I overheard a conversation you were having at the City of Games with somebody about the fact that they told you that there was like 300 games on the pallet and there was only 250, and they didn't know where the other 50 were. Yeah. And it's like
it's that thing where, like, when you design a game, you have, you know, if you're designing and publishing it yourself, you have full control over everything. But there becomes a point where obviously a lot more third parties get involved. And whether that's the manufacturing companies, the shipping companies, the fulfillment companies, or other kind of companies that can be there, you get to a point where you have to start learning how other people do things, and obviously letting other people do their roles. And one of the hardest things of that, you know, as example, as you just said, our manufacturers in China will put games in boxes or cartons. Those cartons will go onto pallets. They will then load those pallets into containers. Then someone will drive those containers to the boat. Someone will put them onto the boats. The boats will sail. Someone will take them off the boats. Another person will take them from the boats to the fulfillment center or your warehouse. And then obviously people there will start kind of going through them. So you have this real challenge where if something goes wrong in one of those steps, whose responsibility is it?
Right.
This year we had a problem where I'm in a couple of our containers, and we had lots of containers, so it was a very subset of them. Some of our pallets fell over, and a result of that was the pallets at the bottom obviously got crushed because they were kind of sideways and had additional weight on them. And then you get into this conversation where it's like, well, did the manufacturers pack them correctly into that place? Did the person loading them onto the boat tilt the container too much? Did the person taking them off the lorry tilt them too much? You know, did the boat go through a storm and that caused them to fall? So you have this real sense of no one wants to claim ownership, and it becomes very difficult if there is a problem to decide who's responsible. And as such, as the kind of the customer in that case, myself, you just have to plan for these things and kind of do what you can with the variables as they happen.
And what did you do in that particular case?
So in that instance, I've basically now launched an insurance claim, and the insurance claim is basically they are investigating whether or not they believe it was their fault or the manufacturer's fault. Right. And I've spoken with my manufacturers and said, you know, here is an insurance company. You can provide them with whatever information you want. And they've recorded videos of themselves packing the containers. So they've got a lot of documentation on that. Okay. And they've basically come to the agreement of, if the insurance company say that it's their fault, even though they will then compensate me. And if they don't say that, then the insurance company will compensate me. Okay. So they're kind of having this battle between them of who should be the compensation for that. Yeah.
So you paid for it, and now you're trying to get the money now. Do you mind sharing roughly how much extra that cost that was unplanned for?
Yeah, so the challenge with that is the cost of manufacturing versus the cost of sales.
Right.
So from a manufacturer and from an insurance perspective, they will obviously only give you back what the actual cost to me was in the first place.
Right, okay.
So effectively, there was about £5,000 worth of cost, which then kind of gets extrapolated up to about £25,000 of RRP sales.
Yeah. Which is quite a lot. What I'm thinking here, the reason I'm going down this line is City of Kings was a big successful Kickstarter and made a lot of money. Okay. Lots of Kickstarters go up there and make 15 grand, 20 grand or something like that. And there's lots of games funding all the time. And just yesterday, I found out that one of my former clients, who I did some work for last year, they've now gone. And that game will not ever come out. So I've done a rulebook for a game that's possibly not ever going to come out. Thankfully, I got paid. I got my invoice paid, but they've now disappeared, and that's gone. And there's various reasons why it could have happened that I don't want to go into it here. But one of the reasons could have been exactly what you've described, and they've said, right, we need 10 grand, to print more, and you're like, well, hang on a minute, I haven't got 10 grand, and then all of a sudden, that's it.
And it's super difficult, because the other side of it is, okay, fine, maybe my manufacturers are going to give me that money, or the insurance company are going to give me that money. But what if all of those games are meant to be going to backers of my Kickstarter?
Yeah.
Because
that's unhappy backers.
They're destroyed. So at that point, you have to try and make sure you produce enough extra. But then what happens if you produce too many extra and you can't sell them? Yep. So you have this fine line. And again, as I said earlier, with the City of Kings, which is a huge game, so these costs all kind of you get pros and cons, because a £5,000 error isn't a big issue in the grand scheme of things, but equally there are other elements which become expensive. So with 36 games per pallet, if you want to store 1,000 games, that's 30 pallets that you're paying someone to keep in a warehouse somewhere. So, you don't want to suddenly have hundreds of pallets of games that are costing you thousands of pounds a month to store. Yeah. And you've got this real balance between what is the right amount. And you see people, like Stronghold with Terraforming Mars, or recently Stonemaier with Wingspan, and people saying, oh, why didn't you do more, and why didn't you do less, and so on. And it's like, I get it, because it's thousands and thousands of pounds of extra shipping, of extra storage, of extra admin and processing. And it's really, really difficult to get it right. I mean, I don't think it's technically possible to get it right. You can never know for sure.
So obviously, that was your first Kickstarter. Yeah. And you're relatively new to the board game industry. Yeah. How, did you research it, look into it, or have you just got a natural talent for the business side of things?
So the special word which everyone should always remember when doing this is Excel or spreadsheets, depending on how you want to do it.
Another topic of the discussion for this podcast, yes.
But I have a spreadsheet which is... I don't know, it's kind of like the Hellmouth to like another world, it's got so much stuff in it. But my background coming from, logic and programming, and also working with, multi-million and billion pound kind of projects, is just understanding variables. And, you get given a specific and knowing how to deal with that, and knowing what the kind of the best and worst case is. Yep. So the design philosophy of City of Kings was always, in each situation, what is the best and worst thing that could happen? And with my spreadsheets for the Kickstarter, it was in each situation, what was the best and worst thing that can happen? Right. And just doing the calculations on every range, what I think will happen, kind of 10% better, 10% worse, or extreme better and extreme worse, and just making sure that everything somehow would kind of still work out depending where the needle dropped on all of those different lines.
Cool. Right. So your background in dealing with big projects helped with that.
Yeah, for sure.
And it did help then, I'm guessing.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think that I know one of the questions that's coming up to do with kind of Brexit and stuff, and this kind of spreadsheet is really kind of related to that kind of stuff, so I'll kind of touch on it a bit more as we kind of go through the further stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I was about to jump through to the first question anyway, so it's a good segue into it. So
no, sounds good.
Yeah, first question in from Chewy. how will Brexit affect shipping to the UK versus the EU? It's a bit unfair asking you that question.
Yes.
You should be asking the government.
And it is. And it's one of those things, though, where I think about this every day, as weird as it might sound. I mean,
need to be aware of it.
I have to be aware. The last shipment I did was 45,000 boxes of stuff. And that was like, 20, 40-foot shipping containers.
Yeah.
And the costs for shipping these things around the world are insane. Putting it into numbers, in the last 12 months, I've spent over £200,000 on shipping.
Right.
And a lot of that I pay in different currencies, and one of the big positives of being a company in the UK and being a company that's obviously turned over a certain amount of money is that I am VAT registered. So what this means is when I buy stuff, the VAT tax, which we have in the UK, which is a 20% tax on the majority of items, I don't have to pay. Mm-hmm. So when I import items into England, normally we pay customs on that, which is effectively that kind of VAT charge. You're paying the tax of the items you bought externally from the country as they arrive into the country. And as a VAT registered company, whilst I pay that money, I get to reclaim it. Yeah. And that means that, tens of thousands of pounds worth of tax I don't have to pay. So when we talk about shipping friendly to different countries, we're effectively talking about ways to stop the customer, the person who's backed the project or bought the game, having to pay that tax.
Yeah.
And because the entirety of the EU, or majority of the EU, is within VAT, and once it's imported into the UK, you don't then have to pay more tax when you put it into the other countries. So with Brexit, the fundamental is, depending on the agreement that gets decided between the government, is how that kind of customs fee gets arranged. And if I import into England and then export from England into France, if I have to pay that again.
Yeah.
And one of the things that a lot of people are kind of starting to look into in kind of fulfillment centers terms is whether the best option then is to register another company in a European country.
Right.
And that way you can kind of reclaim that tax back on both ends. So you're never having to pay it. So I think fundamentally, to answer the question, is no one knows how it's going to affect it, because it'll be dependent on what our governments decide, and that's still kind of up in the air.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, the biggest challenge will be how to still provide friendly shipping where people don't have to pay custom fees, and that will come down to either us having to create multiple countries or being registered in multiple countries, or having third-party fulfillment centres that manage that for us, but effectively just a lot more complication, which adds more risk and more things for new people to kind of learn and be aware of.
Yeah, and as you say, you've got to be thinking about this, because in just over a month's time, we might be leaving, and we currently don't know what the arrangement is yet. So
exactly, and I mean, the last thing I'll say on this, which touches back to what I was saying earlier about kind of costs and stuff, is the biggest impact Brexit has had so far is the variance in pound to dollar value. And that is a huge kind of thing for people running Kickstarters, because, and to put that into numbers perspective, when I got my quotes for my manufacturing for the second run of the City of Kings, that was basically a year ago, and those numbers are a fixed dollar fee that I know I'm going to pay.
Yeah.
And 2 months ago, I paid those. So it was like 10, 11 months after getting that number. Okay. And the dollar fee never changed. Yeah. However, during that period of time, the value varied between $40,000 simply because of how much the pound changed. So there were days where I was sitting there with Sarah going, right, if we had to pay our bill today, we'll be paying $40,000 more than we would have been if we had paid it 6 months ago. And that is very, very challenging. So what I've ended up doing now is I've actually set up multiple bank accounts in multiple currencies, and I actually store a lot of my money as US dollars so that I can bypass the effect of that kind of shift.
Yeah. Right. Stephen Robinson wants to know, how would you decide on who will print the game for you? And my first question before you answer that one is, did you use the same printer for Fedora Gardens as you did for City of Kings?
Yes, I did.
Right.
So I think there's two answers to this. There's for a first-time person and for someone who's printed multiple games. Yeah. And then probably for someone who's printed hundreds of games. And for me, for the first game, so the first print of City of Kings, it was very much researching, working out who does what. There are lots of manufacturers out there. They make lots of different games for lots of different companies, and you'll be surprised by how many different manufacturers make some of the games
Yeah.
The second step of that is obviously trying to find people who have worked with these companies and trying to get recommendations and see the pros and cons. And then the third step of that was talking with them and understanding who was best for you. So one of the big kind of companies out there a lot of people use is Panda. For me personally, I use a company called Watts Games, and that's Watts, which is WHATZ, which is hard to pronounce. But for me, the reason I kind of ended up working with Watts is that Watts Games, I believe, produce end results which are as good as Panda. The benefit that Panda has is that they basically have an American layer of kind of account managers and project managers that are kind of an interface between you and the Chinese manufacturers, meaning that you can talk to them in plain English, and then the Americans will talk to the Chinese guys to make sure that you kind of get the end result. And on top of that, you're paying an extra fee to kind of cover that interaction.
Yeah.
Now, for me, coming from a kind of business analyst programming background, I'm very used to writing very detailed specifications and requirements documents. So I was very comfortable working directly with our manufacturers, and I prefer the concept of understanding the problems and being kind of able to work with them so we can improve over time.
Right.
So I chose Watts because I believe they do a good kind of end result, whilst they have a good price, but equally kind of I know that I can work with them because of the way I like to work.
Yeah.
So second game and second print of City of Kings, obviously the second print I kept with the same company because I was happy the first time around and it made sense. For Fedorian Gardens, equally, why try and find a new company at this point where it's a smaller game and I'm happy with it? But obviously moving forward, as I kind of get into games 5, 6, 7, there is the concept of having, too many eggs in one basket and not wanting the risk of what happens if my only manufacturer kind of does disappear in some way. So I will again kind of start exploring the other options at some point.
Cool. Right, next question from Dim Halo. What was the greatest oversight in the making of City of Kings, and what was the greatest foresight that helped avoid something bad? So what went badly wrong that you didn't foresee?
I think lots of things in many ways, but the kind of the biggest one that had the most impact, I think, was the boxes. For our first print, we made the game in a box, like all games, and it's a big game.
Not
it's a
all
heavy
games.
game.
There was that famous Kickstarter from a few years ago where they didn't send a box. So, but anyway, sorry to
it's like many games.
Most games, yes.
But when you're building, a lot of people, manufacturers, they're used to these kind of standard boxes, and especially a good few years ago before these big Kickstarters became more and more of a thing. And when I came along and said, I need this box that's 3 times the size of a normal box, they kind of gave me recommendations on how to reinforce the box, the thickness of the box, the materials to use, and they gave me the kind of guidelines on how to manage that. And at the time, I obviously trusted them on this because I didn't know the difference between 2mm, 2.5mm, and 3mm of cardboard based on strength and kind of how much weight that can hold and how much you can put on it and so on. So the result of that was the first print run, a lot of our boxes just weren't to the level that I wanted. And I was really unhappy because I love the box of the City of Kings. The artwork, I think, is like one of my favourite pieces of everything that we've done. And the game, I've always tried to put as a high quality kind of really nice production. And I felt like the box, which is the first thing you touch, kind of let that down.
Right.
And for me, for the second print, we used a completely different set of materials and a different process. The box is much stronger, it's much more resistant. And I've now made a flat out kind of rule that we're just going to use that for all of our boxes.
Okay.
So even Fedorian Gardens is using this super thick, super strong box just because I want to keep it the same. I want to keep it kind of a standardized approach, and I don't want to try and save a few pennies to risk that something might happen.
Okay, so we're saying the greatest oversight, but it sounds like that was kind of outside your control. You'd been promised it would be good, and it wasn't.
It was, but perhaps I could have done more testing on it. Perhaps I could have
Ask for
asked more
sample.
questions about it.
Yeah.
Perhaps I, when they sent me the samples, I could have just been a little bit more kind of, is this right? Is this kind of,
Okay.
and I don't know. It's one of those things, it's an oversight. I don't know if I could have done it better, but I was very disappointed with the result of what happened.
Okay. And the flip question, what is the greatest foresight that helped avoid something going badly wrong?
I think that's a difficult one, but I guess fundamentally it must have been as I mentioned earlier with my spreadsheets, kind of having this range of values of best case and worst case, because we definitely had issues and some of those things became a lot worse than I expected and some were a lot better. And I think that if I had just gone through it saying, this is the quote, this is the quote, this is the quote, therefore this is the number, then I would have been in serious problems at the end.
Okay. Cool. Right. Brian wants to talk percentages.
Cool. I love numbers.
And I've got my own opinion on this as well, from what I've been told. So it'd be interesting to see what you think. So what are the margins on making games? How much do the retailers generally make? And in general, are the economics of making and selling games sustainable? So here's what I know.
Cool. I was going to say, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so as far as I know, a retailer would buy a game from a distributor, such as Asmodee,
Yep.
for, I think, it's 60% of RRP.
Okay.
That right?
Yeah, so generally that's the number that's talked about. It can vary, but that's the kind of a good starting point for sure.
Yeah, so 60% of RRP is what the retailer will buy it from the distributor.
Yeah.
And I know that because I used to have an account with Estevium and I saw the prices and I know various people who run shops. So it wasn't a guess, but that's pretty much what I thought. But that was like 10, 15 years ago.
Yeah.
So it's good to know that stayed roughly the same.
They often will have kind of deals, where if you're a retailer that buys games from all the time, depending on the quantity and what you're buying, that you get different like rates and slight kind of benefits over that. But the pure standard is that you pay 60% off.
60%.
Yeah.
What I don't know is how much the distributor pays for it.
So generally everything, it works in kind of 20%. So the fundamental way that people advise that you plan around all of these things in simple terms is you take all of your costs and everything it's going to cost you to make a game and you sit that at 20%. So you multiply that by 5 to get your RRP. Okay. So effectively, if your costs are 20%, your personal profit, if selling to a distributor, becomes 20%. Mm-hmm. A distributor will be paying 40%, and obviously the retailer will be paying 60%, and then they'll be selling it for 100%.
Or 80, 90%.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Obviously, though, those numbers really vary because sitting there and saying, well, I'm going to get all of my costs and then I'm going to multiply it by 5. If I'd done that on City of Kings, then the RRP would have been kind of about £40 higher. And
okay.
It was a real challenge because obviously you want to make sure you end up kind of making a profit at the end of the day and at least covering your costs. Yeah. Understanding where to save money and what to include. So, for example, do you include your own time in that? If you're a big company, yes, you need to include full time at a full salary rate. As a kind of, individual doing your first project who's doing 18 hours a day for 4 years, maybe you're going to kind of adapt those prices a little bit. Yeah.
Well, it's like me, I'm organising my first actual proper convention at a venue this year. And if it breaks even, what I've been saying is if it breaks even, great. Even if it ends up costing us a bit of money, it doesn't matter. It's the first one. And then many people have said, how much time have you spent on all of this already? And I'm like, about 20, 25 hours, maybe 30. How much will you have spent on it before the event happens? Oh, probably about 100 hours. Mm-hmm. Right, well, there you go. And it's like, but I'm not costing that time in because it's me. Yeah. If I was paying somebody else to do it, you're right, it would be a cost. So...
And, the cost of things vary. So, for example, manufacturing, often you'll hear people talking about a minimum print run of like 1,000 copies of a game. And when you launch a Kickstarter, you've got to look at it and go, how many am I going to sell? And if you're a first-time person, you're working towards that 1,000 number because that's the minimum you can get. But if you sell more than that, your cost comes down. So the difference between 1,000 copies in the City of Kings and 10,000 copies of the City of Kings is a good $4 or $5 off each copy of manufacturing. And, so when you're saying, well, 20%, is 20% your 1,000 copy price, your 10,000 copy price? And there's lots of kind of little bits where you just have to decide personally for you where you feel that your numbers kind of sit right.
So here's an example. I've just designed a game. I've gone on Kickstarter with it. It's available for, let's say, $50.
Yep.
And I've sold. I've had 1,000 backers.
Yep.
Right. So I've had 1,000 backers at my $50 game.
Yep.
How many do I print?
And that, I think, if anyone knew the right answer to that, they'd be very successful. But
that's your spreadsheet. Put it in your spreadsheet. See what it says.
So the answer to that comes down to a couple of things. So you've got the black and white, which is the first. You need to make sure that you've got your 1,000 copies of the game for your 1,000 backers.
Yeah.
You then need to consider the additional copies of the game that you will need, and for that I mean damages, lost items, and
parts replacements. Yeah.
So you need to make sure that you have at least 1%, ideally 5% extra, just to cover that. With us, with our shipping damage, when those pallets collapsed, if we had no extra games, that would be people without games.
Yeah.
You then have to make the decision of, are you going to retail and continuing to sell, or is it a one-off? And also if you're sending copies to reviewers or not. So if you were to print 1,000 games, then I would if you were to sell 1,000 on Kickstarter, then if you're not getting kind of stampeded by hundreds of people, then I would probably look at kind of 1,500 copies of the game.
Right.
But if you were to sell, 3,000, then perhaps you'd be looking at 4,500 or something like that. So the numbers and percentages kind of escalate the more demand there becomes.
Right. Okay. So, Rick Howard wants to know, we've got a few questions. Do you believe it's worth attempting to cost save by skimping on quality?
So for me personally, no.
I know the answer to that.
Yes. I'm a big fan of spending money to get things right.
Yeah.
I like to try and provide premium experiences, and I don't ever want to cut corners. And I think that's personal to my personal beliefs and what I want to achieve with my kind of company. I think for some people that is 100% the right thing to do, but for me, I just don't see the benefit of it.
Yeah, it's interesting because, obviously cost is a thing and people will not buy games if they're too expensive. But on the flip side, you've got people going out and buying fancy deluxe inserts and, blinged up components costing more than the game itself. So,
it becomes very challenging. So, for example, Vador Gardens, it's a small card game that comes with custom meeples that are silk printed or screen printed on both sides. So they've got artwork on both sides of the meeples. It's got a nice insert. It's got a whole bunch of kind of wood and bits in there. And it's got a very thick box, a very strong box with linen finish and so on. All the cards are the thickest linen cards you can get.
Yeah.
And I sat there saying, well, if I was to put this on Kickstarter, I wouldn't want all of those upgrades to be stretch goals, because this is, for me, the baseline of what I want to produce.
Right. Okay.
And arguably you could say, you could save loads of money by cutting those down, but I don't care because I just want to make sure the end result is what I want the end result to be. Okay.
And Rick's asking, is it worthwhile releasing two versions of a game, a budget and a deluxe, to meet the expectation of all consumers?
So...
For you, probably no.
Something I've learned from kind of doing the previous Kickstarters is no, but yes. So what I mean by that is I don't think it's worth having two copies of the game that specifically say retail game and deluxe game, but I do believe that it's 100% worthwhile having a copy that is retail and then a copy which is effectively the deluxe upgrades or the deluxe extras.
Right.
Because the extra costs in having two versions of the game and working out who to sell what to and how many each person wants are just silly numbers. And having just if you buy the base game and later on you decide you like it and you want the deluxe extras, that's a lot easier to manage than saying you need to buy the whole thing again.
Yeah, I mean, have you seen Gugong?
I have, yes.
Yeah, because there's a base game, there's a standard version and there's a deluxe version of that.
Yeah.
So they've obviously made the decision to do two different versions.
Yeah.
And I'm interviewing Gil Hover tomorrow, and he went on Kickstarter with his latest game, High Rise, and then pulled it. And that's reason I've got him on the show to talk about the decision of pulling it and why. And it's because it had nice plastic bits where you stack up 3D buildings, and the price was just too much, and almost the entire community just went, no, it's too expensive. So he pulled it from Kickstarter, and he's gone away and he's redesigned it with cardboard chits to reduce the cost. One of the questions I'm going to ask for him tomorrow is, are you going to are you going to release the plastic bits as a deluxe upgrade? Because there were obviously some people that wanted them, and it would look a lot nicer. But it was just the cost was too prohibitive for most backers.
And it's a real challenge to kind of find that balance. And just simple things like, if you buy the deluxe version, are you expecting your box to say it's a deluxe version and the contents of the box to include those extra items?
Right.
Because if you're printing 2 different boxes, even if it's just got an extra word on the back of it, then you're suddenly upping the cost. You're upping the manufacturing problems, you're upping the risks, you're upping all of these things. And you could say, well, just do a sticker and put a sticker on it. But if you've just bought a deluxe version from me,
with a sticker,
do you want a sticker on it? And it's all of these things where you've got to judge the difference. So for me, in the first print run, we did do different boxes, and that actually ended up costing me probably about $8,000 or $9,000 more than it would have if we had just printed one box.
Right.
Just because of the variance. So in the second print run, we didn't do that. We did a single box, and we also had the deluxe upgrade, which you could add into your box.
Right.
And not to overcomplicate it, but I also got to the mindset of, well, if one of our original backers buys the retail version of the game, and then they go to our store and they buy the individual deluxe items and put them into their box, they now have a deluxe version of the game that says it isn't a deluxe version of the game. And
do a sticker for them.
Exactly. So we were just like, let's just let everyone have a standard box, and it's up to them what they put into it.
Okay, cool. Right, questions from David Digby. David Digby has learned recently the wonder that is the InDesign data merge feature, right? Now, I'll be honest with you, I think this is possibly the single best thing for generating prototypes. Mm-hmm. For those people who don't know, basically, you design your game in Excel or some kind of spreadsheet with numbers in columns and the cost and the effect, and you fill so many columns worth of information, what type of card it is and everything. And then there is a feature within InDesign, which is used for creating cards and prototypes and whatever, where it merges all of that information in, and it creates these cards for you. And it's an absolute wondrous tool, and I can't imagine living without it. And here's the revelation, I don't know how to use it. Because I don't actually need to do that for my job. I know about it, I tried once about 3 years ago, I couldn't understand it, so I've not bothered learning it, and I've not needed to. But I'm very, very curious to see how it works, because I know it does, and I know people swear by it, but if you actually asked me to do it, I personally wouldn't be able to do it at the moment. Anyway, so David's just learned that. What other ways can spreadsheets be used for prototyping and playtesting?
So one of the really interesting things about this and the whole data merge side of it to start with is, and I think this probably comes back from my corporate days, and I'm sure you've touched on this as well, is often technologies exist and they're super cool and they're super amazing and they save loads of time, but no one has any idea how to use them.
Yeah.
And when I did the first stuff for the City of Kings, I mean, again, coming from programming, data merge, CSVs and all of this stuff, it was just like, oh my goodness, this is so easy. Boom, 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 done, And there's also extra layers you can have in there for XLT templates, which is a templating language for XML, which you can then start adding design elements and choices and take it even further. And I did all this cool stuff, and then I never found a single person who could actually use any of my files ever. And in the end, everyone was just like, can you just send us the generated version, because we can't do that. And you start talking to people about doing language translations and other people about this and that and copywriting and editing, and just no one could do it. No one could use it. So actually, whilst I found it amazing, I also found that basically no one at the end of the day could actually use it. And as time moves on, more and more people will be able to use it. But it's one of those frustrations where you want to use these cool things, but at the end of the day, not everyone knows how to use them.
Okay.
But to answer the question of other ways to use spreadsheets and prototype and playtesting, I mean, there's lots of things, and it really comes down to the game. I mean, one of the things that I always do is the numerics of all of my cards and all of the kind of stats in my games are always spreadsheeted, and I always generate graphs and other stuff to kind of see how they kind of interact with each other. A big part of it is obviously for recording playtests and decision trees and what people are doing, so seeing how frequently each card gets used, so in the City of Kings, how frequently each character still got used, how frequently people made decisions, and recording all of that into kind of spreadsheets and be able to kind of go through that data is the only way you can really do that kind of thing.
I remember when we were doing Through the Ages, a new story of civilization, and Vlaja got access to all of the data from over 10,000 games played.
Yep.
And he basically just locked himself in a room for a week, and I saw these spreadsheets, and it was just hundreds of thousands of lines and columns of numbers and stats, and then we'd start asking him questions, and he was like, "Yeah, we're going to have to change Napoleon," which we all knew anyway. But it was like he wanted to know exactly why, and it's like, well, Napoleon in 98.3% of the games gets taken at a cost of 3 civil actions, and basically he was analysing this data so much, and then he was like. And in 72% of games, the person who did that with Napoleon then went on to win, and this, that, and the other. And it's like, you need that. So it's interesting that you're doing something similar on a smaller scale. Is you're entering data from your playtests into a spreadsheet so that you can then, use that to generate graphs, and then that advises you on the design decisions.
And I think, especially as the games get more complex, it is the only way to do it. So, as I said earlier, with City of Kings, it's all about knowing the best and worst cases for each situation. And again, with when you find a creature in that game, you put your hands into bags, you take out tokens, and there are literally billions of combinations of what you might get. So for me, it was absolutely fundamentally required that I knew the best and worst case for each situation of what combination of things you could get. Because if you play that game and you get a combination of tokens that create a creature and it is theoretically impossible to beat it, then the game is broken. So for me, understanding the results of different combinations and being able to kind of weight and value, like put values against those and try and make those calculations was the only way to kind of be confident that the end result was a playable game.
Right. Cool. David's second question is, how much does production cost influence development of a game once it's been signed by a publisher? Will they compromise design decisions based on reducing cost? Now, we know your philosophy on that. Put yourself in the mind of other people, because David is a games designer and he's pitching ideas to publishers. So I think he's asking for personal reasons.
No, I think
if he's had a game signed by a publisher, then
this really comes down to what kind of game you're doing, what kind of decisions you're making, and the publishers. So, Paul, are you familiar with a game called Daedalus Sentence?
Yes, big square but thin blue box.
Yes.
Didn't do very well and disappeared into insignificance, I think.
And the biggest challenge this game had was, as far as I'm aware, is when they designed the game, is based on these 3 giant plastic wheels that sit in each other and rotate. And the reason the box is so big is because these plastic sheets have to be a single piece, and they are that large. And I remember reading that it took them so long to find a publisher that was willing to publish the game purely because of the cost of that piece and how difficult it was. So it's certainly, if you go to a publisher and say, hey, we want all this crazy, big, wonderful stuff, then it is going to be something that they may push back on, and it may just be a black and white no, we don't do it, or it may be a requirement to change it. And I think that in the modern day, that decision of how deluxeified and special your stuff is one of the things that probably decides whether you want to be pitching to kind of traditional publishers or Kickstarter publishers.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking back to Tzolk'in from CGE. I was working for CGE at the time, and I remember the original wheels with the cogs were going to be thick cardboard, and the boss had gone off to the printers and they said, we're going to be able to do you a super thick, super resilient cardboard and everything else, and that was the plan. And then they got it and they tried it and they went, nah, this isn't going to work. So they had to... But you're right. What happens if they said, right, the cardboard's not going to work, we're going to have to go resin. Oh, resin's going to cost us an extra $15 per copy. This is going to put the game out of everybody's price range. And suddenly, no game. Because you can't have Tolkien without the gears.
This is one of the things I have with Rising Blades at the moment, is there's a fundamental component, and the way I would like to do it is going to cost me $25,000 just to get the machine that can do it. So that's prior to actually, producing the piece. Right. So we've spent a lot of time recently kind of looking at alternative ways to achieve the same thing. Okay,
so you are in that decision. You're not trying to cut costs, you're not trying to cut quality. Yeah. But you're trying to avoid having to pay 25 grand for something just to do the thing that you want it to do.
Exactly. And it could easily be a stretch goal. If we make like $250,000 on Kickstarter, then suddenly that becomes something that's very viable. Yeah. But if we make $50,000 on Kickstarter, then that isn't something that's viable. So finding options or alternatives that you can hopefully improve given the right situation of a Kickstarter is an option, but with a traditional publisher it's never going to be.
Right. Okay. Moving on, Ian Turner's got 2 questions, although there only seems to be one of them in my Google Docs. So I'll ask you this one and then I'll look up the other one. So number 1, did both games start out with the goal of being what they are now, or did they just holistically over time adapt and change and emerge into said title? So how different is the initial concept idea that you had for both of your games compared to what they ended up being?
So with City of Kings, there was always a goal of what I wanted to achieve with it, and the game has always sat within those boundaries. However, I would say that mechanically, and a lot of the rules and a lot of the things that you do have changed a great deal. So the concept of what you were doing hasn't really changed, but the actual mechanics of how you do it really did. And there were certainly elements during that game's development where I had to change things that I really, really didn't want to change because thematically and mechanically I absolutely love them, but they just did not work and I had to just throw them aside. But the concept is still the same. Fedorian Gardens is obviously a much smaller game, and that really was a game that just kind of evolved from an idea. So Sarah and I kind of were at Essen, and we were walking around and we just kind of started talking about an idea for a game, and actually we went back to our hotel in the evening one night and started working on it, and it just was one of those things. We played it and we're like, it's cool, but this doesn't quite work, let's change that. This doesn't quite work, let's change that. And that game really just kind of evolved out of a series of testing.
Okay. Right. His second question is, how long did it take you from the initial idea of I want to make a game to making a game that's now on the shelves of stores?
So I've always wanted to make games. I think that, so for me, I have to choose a point because I've worked on video games and other projects for many years that never really kind of went anywhere. But the actual day I sat down and said, I want to make the City of Kings, it was 4 years. Right. Now, I should kind of, I guess, caveat that with the fact that obviously it did actually release from the first Kickstarter after 3 years, but it was only that it kind of got into retail after the second print, which was the 4-year mark.
Okay. It's a bit shorter time than mine, because I've been working on one since the late 80s.
It was going to get there eventually, right?
Yeah, maybe. We will see. Right, Ian Gent wants to know initial impressions of how City of Games 2 went as the organiser. And any new lessons learned? Anything that happened this time that you need to learn from that didn't happen last time?
Yeah, I was really happy with it. I feel like the event, whilst I was very happy with the first year, there were a couple of things I wanted to tweak and improve, and I felt like this year those things were improved. Right. There are certainly a couple of things that I'm still kind of working on getting right, but I think that in terms of lessons learned, the convention sold out very quickly. And what we're kind of learning is we need to, I don't want to say choose or dictate, but we need to kind of have a better idea of who our audience is going to be. Because originally, it was kind of, let's have board gamers, let's have role players, let's have card gamers, let's have war gamers and so on. And now really it's become 95% board games. So you're kind of on that mindset of, is it worth having the other events and the other things for that kind of few percent, or should we just kind of make the full transition? So a good example of that this year is we had someone there who was demoing card games, and they said to us, basically no one was interested in it. Like, even when we spoke to them, they just didn't want to play it because they just didn't care about card games. And it's like, well, maybe we should actually just really set the focus on it is board games. And like, I want to be careful because I don't want to just, people who have come for the last 2 years, suddenly kick them out the door. But for me, it's learning how we kind of address that situation.
I mean, to be honest, if you were a card game player and you'd gone to the City of Kings this year, you probably wouldn't go back next year.
Yeah.
Because there was the Keyforge tournament, sure. Yep. But apart from that, as you say, it's not a card game vibe. I didn't see anybody doing any role-playing games. There may have been.
Yeah, no, exactly.
I didn't see that. And the week after you had the City of Games, which is a board game convention in the centre of Bristol, was a games convention in the centre of Bristol.
Yes.
And I got a couple of friends who went along to it, and I need to find out. And they were sort of advertising it as it's tabletop gaming. But as I looked into the website, it was very much role-playing focused.
Yeah, and that's what I gathered as well.
Yeah.
So there's a good kind of transition point of people will be able to not come to ours and to go to theirs if that's more what they're kind of looking for as well. So, like I say, so from a lessons learned, I think that identifying the audience more is something that we probably learned more than anything.
Right.
But other than that, we were generally really happy with it.
Yeah. Right, final question from James. He noticed that at City of Games, there were some great games in the library, but they'd gone unplayed because nobody had heard of them due to limited post-Essen release or other reasons. Did you look at the stats for what games were borrowed and see any surprising stats in terms of good games not getting played? And he's thinking specifically of Realm of Sand.
So I will save you here, Paul, because I could talk about this for about 6 hours, but I'll try and keep it down to a couple of minutes. So fundamentally, I always go through the stats, and I actually release an infographic each year that kind of goes through it. I haven't done it yet this year just because I've got a few other things, but I will do it soon. But one of the things I always say afterwards is we kind of evolve the library each year based on what gets taken and what doesn't. And there are certainly games which I think would get played if people were aware of them. But that comes with two challenges. One, they need to be aware of them, and two, they need to learn how to play them. And we have talked about having like a board, like by the games library, where I personally write 5 or 6 games that no one's playing and I think they should play.
Okay.
But that then does come with that, well, am I teaching them then, or are people willing to teach them?
Yeah.
Realm of Sand's a great one because no one played it. It didn't get taken the whole weekend.
Right.
We actually had it in a more visual place than a lot of other games, and it was on top of a self-standing unit next to a game called The Climbers, and The Climbers got taken 11 times and was, I think, the 9th most played game. So it's interesting that those two games were the only 2 games on one shelf. One of them was the 9th most played, one wasn't touched at all, but arguably the one that wasn't touched is a good game.
Right, okay. Can you give us a bit of a spoiler? What was the most played game taken out of the library?
So, not surprised. I'll run through the top 10 really quickly because there's a couple of points on it. So from 1 to 10, the most taken was Men at Work.
Yep.
The next one was Tokyo Highway.
Yeah.
Then third was Azul. 4th was Azul Stained Glass of Sinatra. 5th was Barron Park. 6th was Fireball Island. 7 was Wingspan. 8 was Santorini. 9 was Climbers. And 10 was Route.
Right.
So it's not surprising that a lot of the shorter games were obviously the most taken.
8 out of 10 of those are 30-minute games. And then you've got Route.
So Wingspan, which was sitting in at 8th. 8th, I think I said. 7th, sorry.
I'm surprised that wasn't
Route,
higher.
Which is at 10th.
Yeah. And what was the number of times? What was the number one again?
Men at Work.
Men at Work. And how many times was that taken
22
out?
times.
22.
Yeah, which over 2.5 days is quite a lot.
Tiny Town still beat it because I think it was about 24 in the end that it got played.
For me, the interesting things there were I was really surprised to see Barron Park at 5th.
Yeah.
Not because it's a bad game, but why? I don't sit there and think that Barron Park is one of the most played games at the moment, but it really was played a lot of times.
Yeah, interesting. And it's more than 6 months old.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of games that old have disappeared and nobody bothers with anymore because there's new and shiny ones.
Exactly. So that kind of was really intriguing. Obviously, it was interesting that Azul and the new Azul were both played basically the same amount of times.
Yeah.
And then that's not too surprising. Seeing Root so high up, again, wasn't surprising because it's just kind of re-released into retail recently and it's very popular.
There's a lot of hype about that at the moment.
And as you say, Wingspan, kind of Fireball Island, both of those games have got a lot of hype. Santorini, again, I was somewhat surprised because it's been out for a few years now. But generally, it's really interesting to see these kind of statistics.
So watch this space for a nice infographic.
Yes.
But Tiny Towns that I was demoing, people kept coming back and saying, can I borrow it and play it again? Or can I? And I'm like, yeah, sure. Because it was, it's relatively easy to teach. Yeah. It only takes about 25-30 minutes at the most, something like that, and it's got some really good, what you were saying earlier on about, don't be put off the fact that Vidorian Gardens is in a small box with a cute animal on the front cover. There's thinking involved in this game.
It's still a deep game as well.
And Tom Vassell summed up Tiny Towns. He said this, the dichotomy of, it's a simple game, it looks really simple, you can teach your family, but actually doing well at it is like, you've actually got to really think about it. So cool. Right, well, that's the end of all of the questions. Cool. So thank you very much to everybody who asked the questions. We've been going for a little bit longer than originally planned, so let's wrap things up there. Thank you very much for coming on. Tell people how they can find you and get in contact with you, websites and stuff.
No, it was completely my pleasure, and thank you for letting me come on, and thank you to everyone who asked questions as well. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube as City of Games HQ, or you can go to our website, which is thecityofkings.com, that has links through to those different channels as well. Yeah.
And that's everything. So thank you very much again for coming on. I will see you, I don't know when I'm going to see you next.
Soon.
We'll say soon. You're going to come down this afternoon, aren't you? Because it's still, the sun's still out here. So, and
I hear there's good ice cream around your part.
There's very, very good ice cream. But after my last trip to the doctor's, I'm having to eat less ice cream than I would have liked. Yeah, one of those things. But never mind. He says there's always a positive. Here's some things that you need to avoid, and he gave me a list, and I looked at ice cream, and I just went, oh.
Yeah. You can find some healthy alternative ice creams, which are slowly getting better.
Okay, I shall look into that. Anyway, right. Thank you very much for coming on, and I'll speak to you soon.
Cool. Thank you very much.
So that's the end of the podcast. I hope you've enjoyed listening, and if you have any thoughts or comments, then please head on over to the Board Game Geek Guild, which is guild number 2258. There will be a thread on there where you can join in with any other discussions, possibly even ask Frank any more questions. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them. If you want to find me, it's Gaming Rules videos on YouTube, Facebook, Gaming Rules vids on Twitter. And as mentioned at the start, thank you very much to all of my patrons who make this podcast possible. If you want to support the show, then please check out my Patreon campaign at patreon.com/gaming rules. Thank you again to Games Law, to Jason Shaw at audionautics.com. Gaming Rules is a member of Punchboard Media, where we all bring something to the table, and a proud supporter of the Board Game Trading and Chat UK Facebook group. Until next time, take care, and thanks for listening.